Alright, let's talk about one of the coolest and most baffling engineering puzzles in human history. So picture this, you're on a tiny remote island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's called Rapa Nui, but you probably know it as Easter Island. Dotted all along its coastline are nearly 1,000 colossal stone statues. These are the Moai. Some are over 30 feet tall and weigh as much as a space shuttle. They stare inland with these solemn, enigmatic expressions, their backs to the endless ocean. For centuries they have stood there, silent witnesses to a civilization that rose and fell, leaving behind a mystery that has captivated explorers, historians, and honestly, guys like me for generations. The real kicker isn't just that they exist, it's how they got there. The quarries where these stone behemoths were carved are miles away from where most of them stand today. When Europeans first arrived, the Rapa Nui people had a simple, almost magical explanation for this incredible feat. They said the statues walked. That's right. They believed the Moai were imbued with a sacred power called mana, and the island's ancient priests used this spiritual energy to command them to get up and shuffle across the landscape to their designated platforms, or ahu. It's an incredible story, a legend that sounds like something straight out of a fantasy movie. This idea of walking statues wasn't just a quirky fairy tale. It was a deeply ingrained part of the island's oral tradition. The phrase they used, neka neka, translates to walking without legs. Imagine the scene, giant stone figures teetering and swaying, moving inch by inch across hills and valleys under their own power. It's easy to see why this story took hold. It provides a beautifully simple answer to a mind-bogglingly complex question. How do you move an 80-ton rock without wheels, without cranes, or large animals? You don't. You tell it where to go, and it walks itself there. This myth became the default explanation for centuries. But for a builder, a maker, a mythbuster, that kind of answer is just the beginning of the real question. It's a fantastic story, but it's also a challenge. The Rapa Nui people didn't have access to alien technology or forgotten magic. They had rope, they had wood, they had manpower, and most importantly, they had ingenuity. The legend of the walking Moai is more than just a myth, it's a clue. It's a verbal blueprint left behind by the engineers themselves, a description of the motion they achieved. The real mystery wasn't if they moved them, but how. One of the first big names to tackle this puzzle was the Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl. In the 1950s, he popularized the idea that the statues were dragged, lying flat on wooden sledges, using a massive Y-shaped sledge, and a whole lot of people pulling on ropes. Heyerdahl's work was groundbreaking, one of the first practical experiments. He showed moving a Moai with primitive tools was possible. However, his theory had problems. It would have required an incredible amount of timber for sledges. Archaeology suggested the island's forests were already dwindling. The friction would have been immense, and the risk of damaging the statues huge. A solid first attempt, but the puzzle remained. Then other researchers brought new perspectives. In the 1980s, Charles Love conducted his own experiments. He theorized the statues were transported lying on their backs, on two parallel logs that acted as runners. His team built a track and moved a 10-ton replica a short distance. The method reduced friction and seemed more efficient. Another piece of the puzzle. With enough people and enough wood, you could slide a giant across the landscape. Yet it clashed with the island's oral history. The real shift came when archaeologists looked to the statues themselves. Terry Hunt, Carl Lipo. They returned to the primary evidence. Road Moai from the quarry looked different. Wider, fatter bases than platform Moai. Many were found fallen forward, face down. That suggested they'd been moved upright. If they'd been dragged lying down, you'd expect them fallen on their backs or on their sides just as often. The game was about to change. This is where things get really interesting. This is the part of the process I love most, where you take a wild, unbelievable story, a myth, and you put it to the test. The myth says the statues walked. Science for a long time said that was impossible. The default assumption was that they must have been laid down, dragged, or rolled. But what if the myth wasn't a metaphor? What if it was a literal, albeit simplified description of the technique? This is the core of the scientific method clashing with ancient tradition. On one side, oral history passed down through generations. On the other, physics, engineering, cold, hard evidence. Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt took the walking legend seriously. They studied the statue's design and proposed a radical idea. What if the Moai were engineered to be moved upright? The statues have a low center of mass, a curved, forward-leaning belly. That makes them inherently unstable, in a very specific way. It makes them want to fall forward. Not a flaw, a feature. The forward tilt was the key to mobility. Ancient engineers used gravity to help move them. Let's break down the hypothesis. Imagine a team of people with ropes tied to the head of an upright Moai. Pulling the ropes side to side rocks the statue. The statue rocks from one front corner of its base to the other. Each rock lets it pivot forward slightly. A shuffling, waddling walk. The forward lean helps propel it. Teams control the rocking and steering with ropes. It explains a lot. The walking legend. The forward-leaning posture of the road Moai. Why many abandoned statues were found face down. They didn't fall off a sledge, they tripped. The theory challenged decades of research. The scientific community was skeptical. Waddling an 80-ton statue for miles across uneven terrain sounded preposterous. Even more dangerous than dragging. Critics said they'd be too unstable. The stone would chip or crack under repeated rocking. Hunt and Lipo held their ground. Their model was more efficient. It required less wood, just ropes, not massive sledges. And it matched the Rapa Nui people's own accounts. The stage was set for an epic experimental showdown. Before the walking theory took center stage, the main debate was a classic engineering showdown. Was it better to roll or to drag? Both methods have their roots in ancient engineering practices seen around the world. The Egyptians, for example, used massive sledges to move stone blocks for the pyramids. The idea of rolling objects on logs is so intuitive that it has likely been invented and reinvented countless times throughout history. So when researchers first looked at the Moai, these were the two most obvious starting points. They represented two different schools of thought on how to solve the same colossal problem. Let's look at the dragging camp first, championed by figures like Thor Heyerdahl. The main advantage of dragging a statue on a sledge is stability. Once you have the Moai lashed down to a big wooden frame, it's not going anywhere. You just need brute force, a lot of it. Heyerdahl's experiment in 1955 used 180 people to pull a 15-ton statue. Scaling that up, you might need over 900 people to move an 80-ton Moai. The biggest problem, as mentioned, is resources. You need a massive sledge, which requires strong, straight timbers. You also need a way to reduce friction, which means either laying down a continuous track of logs or constantly moving rollers from the back to the front, which is incredibly labor-intensive. The rolling theory, explored by people like Charles Love and later by Czech engineer Pavel Pavel, offered a different solution. By placing the statue horizontally on a series of logs, you could roll it forward. This is much more efficient in terms of friction. However, it introduces a new set of problems. Steering would be a nightmare. How do you keep an 80-ton cylindrically-ish object rolling in a straight line, especially over uneven ground? It would constantly want to veer off course. Furthermore, the immense weight concentrated on the logs would likely crush them, especially if the ground was soft. It's a plausible method for short distances on flat, hard ground, but a multi-mile journey across Rapa Nui's terrain seems unlikely. Both of these horizontal transport theories share a common flaw when you look at the archaeological evidence. The road Moai, those found in transit, show very little damage on their backs or sides, which you'd expect from being dragged or rolled. Instead, the wear and tear is often on the bottom front edge of their bases. Furthermore, getting the statue upright at its destination would be another monumental engineering challenge in itself. You'd have to build a massive earthen ramp and then somehow pivot the statue into a vertical position without it toppling over. The walking theory, on the other hand, means the statue arrives at its destination already standing up. This is the part that feels like a real-life Mythbusters episode. You have a hypothesis that the Moai walked. Now you have to build it and test it. In 2011, Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, working with National Geographic, decided to do just that. They commissioned the creation of a precise replica 5-ton 10-foot tall of a typical road Moai. The key was getting the shape exactly right. The heavy base, the forward, leaned the D-shaped bottom. They weren't just building a statue. They were building a machine designed for movement based on their archaeological observations. This was their moment of truth. The experiment was beautifully simple. They stood the replica upright on a flat patch of ground. A team of just 18 people held 3 ropes, rope on left side of head, rope on right side of head, rope at back for stability and braking. The team started to pull rhythmically, heave left, heave right. At first, the statue just wobbled awkwardly, but then they found the rhythm. The statue began to rock side to side. With each rock, it pivoted forward, lifting and shifting its weight from one corner of its base to the other. It was slow, it was clumsy, but it was moving. It was walking. The sight was incredible. The stone giant shuffled forward, its head swaying back and forth in a surprisingly graceful arc. It looked exactly like the Rapa Nui legends described, Neka Neka walking without legs. The team managed to move the statue over 100 yards in just a few minutes. What was most amazing was the efficiency. It took fewer than 20 people to move a 5-ton object, a fraction of the manpower required for Heyerdahl's dragging experiment. This method required no wood for sledges or rollers, only for the ropes. It was an elegant, resource-light solution that seemed perfectly suited to the island's ecological constraints. This experiment provided powerful proof of concept. It demonstrated that walking a Moai was not only possible, but plausible and even practical. It explained wear patterns on the bases of the road Moai, why they would fall forward if the rhythm was lost, and why the front edge digging into soft ground would stop them. It also aligned perfectly with the oral traditions that had been dismissed as mere fantasy for so long. The myth and the science were finally starting to tell the same story. The ancient engineers of Rapa Nui weren't just master carvers, they were brilliant physicists who understood leverage, momentum, and center of mass. So, have we solved it? Is the mystery of the walking statues officially busted, or in this case, confirmed? Well, yes and no. The experiments by Hunt and Lipo provided compelling, game-changing evidence. Today, the walking theory is widely considered the leading explanation. It elegantly synthesizes the archaeological evidence, the oral traditions, and the principles of physics. It's the theory that checks the most boxes and requires the fewest assumptions. For many in the field, it's as close to a definitive answer as we're likely to get. Case closed, right? Not so fast. Science is never that simple. The debate is not entirely over, and there are still plenty of smart people who remain skeptical. Critics point out that the 2011 experiment was conducted with a relatively small, 5-ton replica on prepared flat ground. They question whether the same technique could be scaled up to move an 80-ton giant over the rough, hilly terrain of the actual ancient roads. Would the stresses on the stone be too great? Would the base hold up to miles of shuffling and pivoting? These are valid engineering questions that are difficult to answer without a much larger and much more expensive experiment. Furthermore, some archaeologists argue that there isn't a single one-size-fits-all solution. It's possible that the Rapa Nui used multiple methods depending on the size of the statue and the terrain. Perhaps smaller Moai were walked, while the truly colossal ones were moved using a combination of techniques, maybe involving temporary wooden tracks or sledges for particularly difficult sections. The island is littered with different types of Moai and different road conditions. It's a bit like asking how we move heavy things today. We don't just use a forklift, cranes, dollies, trucks. The ancient toolkit may have been just as diverse. What we still don't know for sure are the precise details. What kind of knots did they use? How were the rope teams trained and coordinated? Was it a chant, a song, a drum beat that kept the rhythm? How did they navigate sharp turns or steep slopes? These are the finer points that remain lost to time. While the general principle of walking is now the frontrunner, the exact choreography of this incredible stone ballet is a secret the Rapa Nui ancestors took with them. The core mystery is largely solved, but the details remain a fascinating area for future research and debate. So, what's the ultimate takeaway from the mystery of the walking Moai? For me, it's not just about solving an ancient puzzle. It's a profound story about human ingenuity, creativity, collaboration, grit. The Rapa Nui didn't have modern technology. Stone would fiber their own brains, and with that they developed a system so elegant and so counterintuitive that it baffled the rest of the world for centuries. It's a humbling reminder that primitive doesn't mean simple. The journey to understand how the Moai moved is also a perfect illustration of the scientific process in action. We started with a myth, which was dismissed. Then came early theories based on conventional wisdom, dragging rolling. These theories were tested, and they worked, but they didn't quite fit all the evidence. It took a fresh look, a willingness to reconsider the original myth not as fantasy, but as data. That's science at its best. Questioning, testing, refining until the story the evidence tells us makes sense. The Moai statues themselves are more than just archaeological artifacts. They represent the incredible power of a community with a shared vision. Quarry Transport erect hundreds of these giants over generations. Leaders, engineers, skilled craftsmen, a massive labor force. The statues weren't just carved from stone, they were built from the collective will of a people. They are monuments to what we can accomplish when we focus our energy on a single monumental goal. This collaborative spirit is perhaps the most powerful force the Rapa Nui harnessed. In the end, the Moai continue to fascinate us because they hold up a mirror to our own potential. They challenge our assumptions about the past and inspire us with their sheer audacity. The mystery forced us to think like the original builders, to put ourselves in their place and try to solve the problem with the tools they had. And in doing so, we learned something profound about human creativity. The walking statues of Easter Island are a timeless lesson. The greatest tool we have ever possessed in any era has always been the human mind working in concert with other human minds. And that's no myth.